everyone, and welcome to the day's deliberations. There are three presentations in this segment, and which is called Brain, Emotions, and Music. And I'm going to talk about the emotional brain, inspiration, genius, and some of those aspects, followed by Professor Trimble, who talks about brain responses to music and to other arts. And then Dr. Shetty, who's going to talk about poetry, emotion, and memory. Let me start by telling you the story of Vincent van Gogh. He was an extremely productive painter, as we all know, over 2,000 works in a lifetime. But he also functioned with bursts of creativity. In one short period, in hours, he produced 200 paintings, 200 watercolors, and wrote 200 letters to his brother Theo. 1,700 pages, shortest was 6 pages long. So this was someone who was productive both in painting and in writing. And the writing was extremely emotional to his brother. Professor Trimble has written a paper on painting as a form of hypergraphia. And we all know that hypergraphia is an important neuropsychiatric symptom that we see in specific neuropsychiatric conditions. And Vincent van Gogh, certainly during these periods in hours, seems to have been both hypergraphic in painting and in writing letters. Now, his works have been deconstructed by a Harvard neurologist, who interestingly is of Iranian origin. And I had a nice conversation about this with Steve Schachter in Harvard about 3 weeks ago. We were talking about the deconstruction of Van Gogh, and then of course we realized that this was his colleague of Steve Schachter who had done this. And what's been commented is that he probably had seizures when he was painting the particular painting called Over the Ravine, because the brush strokes indicate that he might have had a number of violent episodes while he was doing that. Van Gogh also demonstrated sexual behaviors. He was both hyposexual and hypersexual at different times. And he also demonstrated what is described as emotional viscosity, the inability to terminate arguments easily or discussions easily. And he had great difficulty in doing this, which was one of the reasons why he got into an argument with Paul Gauguin, and the cutting of the ear followed. Van Gogh actually had a kind of a divine, what shall I say, experience. He was having auditory hallucinations, and he heard, "When thine offend thee, pluck it," the biblical injunction, and that is how he cut his ear off. And the portrait of the man with the bandaged ear, as you know, is because he was looking into the mirror. So it looks like it's one side, but actually it's the other side that he managed to cut off. Now Van Gogh exemplifies emotionality, creativity, and the interface between emotionality and creativity, which we will also talk about today as we go forward. He also probably had, apart from seizures, the Geschwind syndrome of temporal lobe epilepsy, which we will talk about as we go forward. Papez was famous for proposing his circuitry of emotions, and he commented that while the hypothalamus was required for the expression of emotion, the experience of emotion required the cortex, the stream of feeling depending on the strong connections between the cortex and the hypothalamus. And it was this presumption that you expressed emotions primarily from your hypothalamus, but you experienced emotions only in your cortex that resulted in his Papez circuit. And of course, what would our lives be if we did not have emotions? I mean, emotions are terribly significant to us. And a lot of our memories, a lot of things that we retain and carry with us as part of our memory, society, and culture are tinged with emotion. I'm sure many of us felt a number of emotions yesterday, both when we heard the lecture by Professor Trimble and the presentation by Krishna. And the point is that it is those that make that whole experience special and leave elements of it with us for as long as we live. And if we didn't have the daily highs and lows, what would life be? It would be a great plane of existence without significance. So the expression of emotion is perhaps the most important part of being human. So Pappas talked about the cingulate cortex, the neocortex, both being linked with emotional experience, including the hippocampus, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And this system that he talked about was determined by activity in the cingulate cortex and less directly to other cortical areas, the famous old picture of the Pappas circuit. Now, when you take a train and come into Chennai, and I'm sure that many of you have had that experience, an hour before you reach Chennai, you realize that you're reaching Chennai. And what actually wakes you up in the morning is the smells of Chennai. And the smells of Chennai, the smell memory is what we share with the rat. And the limbic system, too, is what we share with the humble rodent. So our earliest memories are linked in some way with smell and with emotion. And we were talking yesterday about how cooking, Professor Trimble was saying how cooking is such an important part of human culture. Well, smells are an important part of human culture. Cooking has a lot to do with smells. And our emotional memories probably are also built around a number of these experiences. This is just to illustrate, this was lent to me by Professor Trimble from Leonard Heimer's beautiful pictures to illustrate that this is an endocrine-rich, hormone-rich part of the brain we're talking about. These are just not areas and nerves that we're talking about. We are talking about connections which are very rich in neurochemical systems. Now, one structure that's become very important in terms of understanding human emotion is the amygdala. And the number of studies on the amygdala have multiplied over recent times. It lies on the pole of the temporal lobe on the medial side. And while it was thought to be a single nucleus, multiple nuclei of the amygdala are being discovered progressively. So the count keeps changing as to the number of subnuclei the amygdala have. The afferents to the amygdala come from the various sensory systems, and the removal of the amygdala causes your Kluver-Bucy syndrome, fearlessness, not being able to perceive danger, inability to pay attention, and symptoms of that nature. That is an illustrative picture of the amygdala lent to me by Ludger Toibaerts van Elst, which shows you how many subnuclei there are within it. And this number has changed since the time that I borrowed this from him. This is how it looks when you look at it on an MRI, and when you measure it using the technique that Ludger was using at that time, which has been used by a number of members of the Raymond Way group, where we actually did a manual morphometry of the hippocampal amygdala complex, and then looked at the volumes and compared them to different human emotions. And there are a number of papers on that. The amygdala is important, the limbic system is important, but there's also something to do with the right half of the brain. It's widely understood that the right hemisphere is the creative half of the human brain. I saw a recent paper which says that all that is bunkum, but I don't think that one paper is definitive, and the jury is still out yet on this one. But the right hemisphere also happens to be the emotional half of your brain. So it's both the creative half and the emotional half, which might explain to you artistic temperaments, because a number of people who are extremely creative also seem to express their emotions very, very significantly. And here, let me bring you to this state's favorite poet, Subramanya Bharati. If you read Subramanya Bharati's biography and life and you read his poetry, he clearly had bouts of depression right through his life. He also clearly had periods of euphoria. And the moment he met his maker was probably driven by one such bout of euphoria, because it was in front of the Parthasarathi temple in Triplicane in Chennai when he was inspired and he went under an elephant that was marauding at that time. So everybody else ran away, and it probably is that he ran towards the elephant. And this was unfortunately one of the events that led to his death. He was inspired by a number of things. He was inspired by independence. He wanted India to be independent. So he's a poet of Indian independence. He was inspired by his favorite goddess, and he wrote a lot about his favorite goddess. And it's very interesting, therefore, that there were both social and religious themes to Bharati's poetry and to Bharati's music, and that he also had a number of emotional problems, including mood swings. When we talk about emotions, we talk about emotional disorders, we talk about how emotions are generated, we talk about emotionality, we talk about the Geschwind syndrome. But there's something else also, which is the neurobiology of positive emotions. Because for us to want to do something over and over again, and for us to enjoy doing that something over and over again, it needs to generate a positive emotion. And perhaps one of the themes of yesterday's discussions were about why people cry. In some strange way, perhaps, crying too provokes some positive emotions, which is why perhaps we feel the need to do it over and over again. And here, the basal ganglia and the ventral striatal systems to the frontal cortex become extremely important as generators of positive emotion. And we know that dopaminergic pathways going to the prefrontal cortex are extremely important as generators of positive emotions and for the maintenance of positive emotions. So if you link it up, you actually have the hippocampus, the storehouse of your memories, the amygdala, you have the Papez circuit, which links up the hypothalamus, the cingulate cortex, you have the frontal systems, and all this has a role to play in your emotions in different ways. So the emotional brain is not a particular part of the brain. The emotional brain is the connections that exist from the limbic system to the frontal lobe. One of the reasons why we express hyperemotionality, according to Luria, was the inability of the frontal lobe to control emotions. So frontal dysfunction or inappropriate emotional expression can either be a consequence of hyperemotionality arising from your limbic system, or frontal dyscontrol, the inability of the frontal lobes to control human emotions. Here we see the role of the serotonin, the dopamine, and pathways, both nigrostriatal and mesolimbic, as part of the frontal reward mechanism. Just to take you to another story of a famous Japanese naturalist. He never acquired a formal graduate degree, yet he wrote hundreds of papers on religion and folklore. 50 of those papers were in the journal Nature. So he was by no means a weak scientist. He established the Minakata residence in the Wakayama prefecture in Japan with the emperor's support. So the emperor was clearly impressed with the abilities of this man. He was actively involved in the anti-shrine consolidation protests in Japan, and he actually, there was a hyper-religiosity, hyper-spirituality component to his existence. He remained a virgin until the age of 41. So there was hyposexuality in his existence as well. And he wrote minuscule letters in compact space, a tremendous number of articles, but minuscule letters in compact space, which is thought to be an expression of hypergraphia. He is described as being intense, short-tempered, emotional, and irritable. Why Minakata is famous is not just because, well, he's famous in Japan, not just because he was a cultural icon of sorts, a scientific icon of sorts, but his brain was preserved after his death. And we have a paper in neurology which talks about his hippocampal volumetry. And Kumagasu Minakata had a small right hippocampus. So he had epilepsy, he had the Geschwind syndrome, and he had the small right hippocampus. Again, a very good example of emotionality and creativity all rolled into one. Which just takes us back, therefore, to the Geschwind syndrome. I've talked to you about the various features of this syndrome. And just to bring up Baron-Fedio's thesis, hypothesis, what they proposed a physiological hypothesis. What they said was that when you have temporal lobe epilepsy, you have increased activity in the temporal lobe. This enhances the connection between sensoric input and limbic processing. So all your emotional experience, all your experiences are suffused with an emotional coloration, which is the reason why everything seems so intense in such an individual. And if you link that up with creativity, the ability to perceive what is around you with intensity, the ability to express what you feel with intensity, are both parts of being very, very creative. One of my new hobbies is being on Twitter. And it's very interesting to see how people tweet. Some of the most regular tweeters tweet in bursts. So you'll suddenly see 15 tweets from this person, who'll then go silent for 2 or 3 days, and then comes back. And I don't think it is an expression of their time availability. I think it's an expression of their creativity happening in little bursts. So I follow a few neuroscience and psychology people. And it's very interesting to see the patterns of tweeting that happen from all of them. I can assure you that many of it is in bursts. So you should come on Twitter and watch how people tweet. It's one way of studying human expression. In this study by Baron-Fedio, there was another very interesting component. Because Baron-Fedio scale has got 2 components. It's a 100-item scale, which you give both to the person with epilepsy and to their caregiver, to the person who's very close to them. And it's a true and false scale, so 100 items, true and false. You rate yourself, your relative rates you. And what was very interesting was if you had a right-sided epileptic focus, you were rated by your relative as being more emotional, as expressing greater elation and sadness, and having the tendency to polish your own image. In other words, you thought of yourself better than your relative thought of you. If you were left-sided, you were rated as having a greater sense of personal destiny, you were thought to have more philosophical interests, and you had a tendency to tarnish your own image. In other words, you thought yourself less well than your relative thought of you. And if you think about it, this is very typical of what you see in terms of hemispheric dominance and hemispheric dominance literature as to how people behave. And so therefore, there is a left brain dominance story which is quite different from the right brain dominance story. I try to relate a lot of these things to life. So I'm going to tell you the story of my 2 dogs. I have a German Shepherd and I have a Basset Hound. I've had the German Shepherd a little longer than I've had the Basset Hound. The German Shepherd is a very good owner's dog. He is ready for his morning walk. He'll finish his ablutions in the first 5 minutes of the walk, and then the rest of the morning is the business of the walk. So the other 45 or 50 minutes, you walk, you're not distracted by anything else. He does not need a leash. And you see the traffic in Chennai, but we can walk on the footpaths of these arterial roads without him ever getting lost or leaving me for even a moment. I then acquired the Basset Hound. In his 6 year of tumultuous existence, he's never been off the leash. His entire walk is an exploration, and he has to smell every human being, every plant, anything that passes him on the way. He has to make friends with everybody. And very, very interestingly, he has seizures, and he has outbursts both of affection and of bad temper. So I've got a case study right next to me at home. And I've concluded that I have an ideational, philosophical, left-brain German Shepherd and an emotional, right-brained Basset Hound whose behavior is quite unpredictable. But if you look at people and their temperaments, a lot of people with artistic temperaments are more right-brained. They are more exploratory, they are more emotional, they are more willing to express, and they are less willing to be tied down by rules and regulations and what we expect people to follow. And I think that these hemispheric differences do perhaps exist in many strange ways around us. We've done some studies as part of the Raymond Way group looking at the hippocampus and the amygdala and its role in various psychiatric disorders. And what's interesting is we did these studies in epilepsy about 10 years ago now. There's a huge amount of literature that's come since showing the importance of the hippocampus in schizophrenia, first episode schizophrenia, in depression, and a number of other conditions. This paper by Wofel, which I have quoted, is perhaps, apart from the MRI deconstruction of Kumagasu Minakata, the only other objective piece of scientific literature that has shown a link between small right hippocampus and hyperreligiosity. This was in a group of people with severe hippocampal atrophy or sclerosis. I had the pleasure of reviewing this in JNNP in 2007, and there's been quite a bit of literature. We're actually writing another review at the moment, which really talks about how the hippocampus has become critical, has become a region of interest for a number of neuropsychiatric disorders. What seems to be important is hippocampal atrophy or sclerosis and amygdala preservation. And there seems to be a right-sided, once again, preponderance to a lot of this literature. So a right-sided preserved or larger amygdala seems to be linked to a number of disorders of emotional expression, a number of psychiatric syndromes. So we say that left-dominant, brain-dominant individuals are more ideological and philosophical, more motivated by social, pragmatic, rather than emotional concerns, more diligent, more purposeful, capable of greater tenacity, and driven more often by a sense of duty. On the other hand, right brain dominant people have a better appreciation of the world around them, greater creative ability, a proclivity for the finer aspects of life, and tend to be more mood and emotion driven in making their choices, both day-to-day ones and those that are life-defining. This perhaps is one of the differences that we see. The use of language, poetry, and metaphor produces heightened activity in the right hemisphere. This is something that we do know. And we also know that people with creative pursuits are strongly associated with disorders of the mind. Both bipolar affective disorder and schizophrenia have been described in this group. And in poetry, there are several examples of such overlap. I draw your attention to Professor Trimble's book, The Soul and the Brain, where he asks the question, why are we, the human race, so moved by poetry, music, and art that we are reduced to tears not tears of sorrow, but tears of elation and ecstasy. And in Indian history, we have a number of figures who were moved to tears of sorrow, to tears of elation and ecstasy. People like Saint Tyagaraja, who was moved by Lord Rama and his devotion to Lord Rama. Purandaradasa, who was moved by Lord Vithoba. And of course, Subramanya Bharati, who was moved by his motherland. And Subramanya Bharati actually had a very evocative poem called Kani Nilam Vendum. Kani Nilam Vendum is, I want a small piece of land. And he wasn't asking to own a small piece of land. His poem is directed at having a small piece of land that was independent of British rule. So he was really talking about an independent small piece of land. Professor Trimble's next book tries to answer the question about why people cry. And in it, he says, tears are an accompaniment of tragedy as an art form, as they reflect the tears of everyday human tragedy, which is linked to loss and mourning. These feelings have arisen in the course of our long evolutionary history, notably with the rise of self-consciousness, the development of small communities, the growing potential of love, and hence an even greater sense of loss. And I think the expression of emotions and the perception of emotions are so critical, both for our ability to cry and, of course, as we heard yesterday, our ability to laugh. So to take you back, therefore, to this wonderful structure, Dr. Chokilingam yesterday was talking about what would you rather have, your heart or your brain? I would rather have my brain. And I think that the critical thing is obviously to recognize that a lot of what we experience, a lot of what we feel, a lot of what brings richness into our lives is the emotions that we perceive. And there is a number of structures in our brain and their linkages that are responsible for us to be able to perceive and feel those emotions. And I think your emotional brain, therefore, is a watch this space place, because as we go further, as we are able to do tractography, as we are able to do more dynamic imaging, we'll probably understand more and more about this. And I agree with Professor Trimble that this area of neuroaesthetics is probably one of the most fascinating and growing areas of neuroscience. And Dr. Chandran Nyanamuthu was saying we should have more neurologists here. I certainly wish we did so. I leave you with Rabindranath Tagore. A mind is all logic, like a knife all blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it. Thank you so much.